Hello, I'm Nejmi Alexander, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Glenn P. Wallis. Welcome to Impactful Conversations, where we hope to have an impact on you, the listener, that also allows you to go forward and have bigger, bolder impacts on your teams, with your leadership, and with your organizations.
Hello, and welcome to today's Impactful Conversation. We thought today we'd cover a topic that I think is really relevant for anyone that's navigating through transformation or change, which is really around, how do you minimize the risk for a change, or a transformation, or conversely the upside. How do you maximize your chances of success in delivering the outcomes and the change, effectively, without all the pains or fewer of the pains along the way, which I think is a great kind of question to explore. What do you think around that framing, Glenn?
I think that works really well. And I think it's really important that we establish from the get-go that whilst, yes, we may well be sharing our thinking and some of the more recent research with chief transformation officers, those in the transformation office, those senior executives who are charged with bringing around a transformation inside the organization. We're also talking about every single leader of people in the organization, because ultimately, in one form or another, everybody's responsible for that transformation landing successfully, right? So it's a bit like some of the initiatives that get labelled as an HR thing, and they're not actually an HR thing; they're the organisation's thing. It just happens that they might be sponsored by HR, and in this sense, it's might be sponsored by transformation, but it's everybody's responsibility. And to your point, I think that's why it makes it so important, is because it touches everybody, and everybody's got a responsibility, to help it land effectively.
And it's interesting distinction that you make there around, the executive, the senior leaders who might be a little bit ahead of the change. And what I mean by that is, they've led on the thinking around it, right? Or a lot of the change obviously typically driven from the top, but then you've got this other community of folks who are leaders, maybe like the middle, is how we could describe, who might arrive at the change, maybe might have some functional input, but might arrive at the change a little bit behind that community, but are just as, maybe even more important, in really executing on that change, on making sure that the outcomes are realized, as part of that process.
Yeah. In fact, there was a lovely analogy or metaphor rather that. Last year I spoke to 72 chief transformation officers or chief operating officers and chief people officers inside UK organisations. So that sample was based only in the UK, and one of the people that I spoke with described it beautifully as, the problem is that the senior leaders and the executive have been talking about this thing for months, potentially. And so they're very familiar with it. And it's a bit like the first carriage of a train arriving at a station before the rest of the train, sidles up to platform 13. And I think there's some real truth to that, which is the challenge is that what can feel like we've been doing this for ages for the most senior leaders in the organisation and those directly responsible for change are at odds often with the timing of the rest of the organisation. And I think you can make lots of assumptions and make lots of errors based on the fact that we all understand this equally, if you fall into that trap, for sure. So, yeah, I think, so we're talking about, yes, maybe the leaders and those directly responsible, but we're also speaking to everybody. And I guess one of the reasons that it's so important is you think about the cost of a big transformation effort, both direct and indirect, is huge. And then if you couple that with the amount of time that they suck up to get completed, I mean, we're often talking about months, potentially years. I had it quoted at me that several times that, really to land transformation as a minimum, you're talking about 2 years, usually 3 to 4. I don't know whether that's right or not, but that was the anecdotal feedback that we got. So you've got the direct and indirect cost, you've got the time, and I just think the energy that it takes, so it's a massive drain on the human energy of the organisation that could be being used differently, or maybe we just learn to do it more efficiently so that we can retain as much of that energy inside the organisation, so we don't start to all suffer from change fatigue. So I think that the reasons for trying to help people do this more successfully are clear to us, and by people we're talking about now all of the leaders inside the organisation. So I think it's a super important topic. Covers almost every organisation of most sizes, and I know you've got a particular angle on the size piece too. And it's just really, really important, and still not being done apparently very effectively within organisations.
What was that stat? You mentioned a stat before around how effectively change is being delivered. What was it?
Yeah. And John Cotter's work, professor at Harvard Business School, and I really like a lot of the work that he has done it around change. There's a lovely 8-step model framework for leading change, which many of those elements kind of have seeped into almost the way we talk about change. And I don't think he often gets quite the credit that he deserves. But he talked about 70% of all organizational transformation fail in one form or another. They either fail catastrophically or they fail to deliver the key deliverables that they were tasked with. But what I would say right off the bat is I find that figure true, false, helpful, and unhelpful, all in the same breath. And what I mean by that is true because it'll have done the research thoroughly and it'll have been a well-defined piece of research, but it's only one. And I don't know whether the number, and again, I've done a lot of reading around this topic, as you might expect, and actually that number actually ranges from somewhere between 40% and more like 80%, depending on how you define failure. So actually, it's a very broad spectrum. I think what we can probably say is almost all organizational transformation efforts don't deliver all of the things that were set out for it to deliver at the beginning, which makes it massively challenging. So I think it's both true and it's not true, and also it's helpful because it will alert us to the fact that actually transformation is difficult. It's very complex often, it's complicated, and it's genuinely challenging to get right. So it's helpful for us to be aware of that. It's kind of unhelpful because it doesn't really, in itself, doesn't tell you how you might go about mitigating some of those risks. His model does, but the number itself doesn't really mean anything. And I think the challenge is it also sets an expectation that it's going to be difficult. Whereas actually what might be better is if we were going to nail this and use more of an appreciative inquiry type approach, I suppose, if we were going to really nail this, what would good look like? How do we go about setting that up rather than playing defense? And I'm not suggesting we don't take any, as will come through our conversation, note of the risks, but it's, being on the front.
Yeah. So, based on what you just described there, Glenn, it's like, transformation in and of itself, unsurprisingly, is quite complex. It can take quite a long period of time, and is inherently risky because of a variety of factors. Primarily because, to my kind of broad brush thinking, because it's people, right? Ultimately, you're delivering change, to expectations of change to how people behave or how interact or act with leverage technology or process or any different range of different ways in which people effectively deliver on outcomes for an organization. When you're navigating through a transformation, you're trying to affect that change through people, and people are inherently both complex and sometimes can be a little bit simpler in some of their wiring as well. And so when you're thinking about how to mitigate or minimize, as we kind of set out as the the exam question, the risks around delivering the outcomes of a transformation, really thinking about how to navigate this change through the people is, to my mind, where a big part of the focus might lie. But when we think about that challenge, how can I mitigate the risk of delivering transformation through our people, or even more broadly, where do you think maybe it's useful to arrive at, what do we think are the critical risks inherent in delivering that change? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, look, I'm not a transformation expert in the sense that that's not my field, but we work with lots of organizations that are going through transformation, right? So we get to see and feel the real impact of that at the very individual level. So I think there's that. Plus, obviously, having done some research recently on it, it's more on my mind, and I think I've got more of an insight than I certainly would have had a couple of years ago. But it's not the work that I do every day, so I just want to be really clear about that. But when we look at organisations and those organisations going through transformation, now when we talk about transformation, let's be clear about a couple of examples that might constitute transformation, I suppose. And the one that we come across quite often is when an organisation has purchased another organisation. So there's either a merger or an acquisition that's gone on, and then they're trying to merge those two organisations together to operate as a new entity effectively, or where an organisation has gone from, let's say, a regional model to a global model, and that can be really challenging to help. So there's a couple of very concrete and real examples that we've been very closely associated with. I think there are 2 or 3 really key things that help. One is being clear on and realistic about the amount of time that transformation is likely to take. So, real example, anonymized. 2 organizations I can think of who had merged, they bought actually other organizations, were merging them into their own, and after about a year were complaining that we thought this would be done by now, and we're surprised that actually things aren't actually completely nailed and moving along smoothly. And my view was, I think you've got to wait at least another 2 years probably before that happens, because it's just unrealistic to think that, not that you can't change processes and systems, although they can be really challenging, but actually it's the people. I've built this business, I grew up with this business, I've been with this business forever, and now I'm under this broad umbrella of another big business. That takes quite a lot of, or can take quite a lot of time for people to adjust to that. So I even that very simplistic version, but I would say that. So that's one thing for me is the time thing, and the other thing is the culture piece. I think when you're looking at how people respond to change, how they meet it, and how they then help it through to conclusion, is almost always a function of how effective your culture is. If you've got a very static culture where people aren't flexible, they're not adaptable, and haven't got some sort of self-starter type mentality, I think landing that change is going to be way more difficult than if you've got those other criteria or features that I mentioned. So I think there's something in how are you preparing your culture ahead of time, ahead of need, so that when it's meeting some of these really large scale changes, it can adapt to those effectively, rather than have to try and force that change through people that aren't in the right space. So I think there's at least a couple there to kick us off with. What about you? What about for yourself?
Well, just building on what you were describing there, across the range of different organisations that I've worked for and worked with, I've been like global, multinational, organisations, both kind of from an internal perspective and external perspective, helping to navigate change or being part of change that's being enacted, but also working in really much smaller organisations, scale up sort of was actually startup size, that quickly grew to very quickly grew to scale up. There's two different examples that come to mind. And it's interesting that you talk about culture. Like in the more mature, like multinational organization, I remember, regularly having conversations with peers around like change being the constant. That actually it felt like it was designed into the way in which the organization was constructed and evolved over time. That even reshifting of the operating model, and just regularly going through periods of transformation would happen, I would say, at a faster pace than you would expect in a mature organization. It felt like every sort of 12 to 18 months there'd be like I would say medium-sized to large significant change in the way in which the organization would operate. And the benefit around that, of course, was that people were already were equipped to get on board with that regularly. It was embedded into the culture to expect that. And it's kind of signals from around an organization, like signals within culture, I think are really powerful. Of course, if I think about like a development culture or a culture of change, when people are more familiarized with that, with the concept of X, because they see signals of it happening regularly, they are more prepared around the need for that. So it's interesting that you talk about it. That's what came up to my mind around. There was I've seen an example of where that was present in the culture, and also at the other end of the spectrum, a much smaller, like less mature organization where in a hyper growth environment. So I was at an organization where I started where there were 50 employees. I joined when there was 50 employees, and I left when there was 800 employees, and that was 36 months later.
Wow.
So really rapid growth. Where again, change was a constant, but it was happening at a far more rapid rate. Every quarter there'd be a change in like the overarching like the objectives of the organization, or the objectives of more specifically the objectives of the team. The organization was evolving, new layers of leadership kind of getting in place, capabilities maturing, all of this happening at a very rapid pace. And again, there was a culture of change in that environment, but actually the speed and the pace at which change was expected led very rapidly to fatigue around change, and also reticence around it too. People didn't feel like they would. After a short period of time, you kind of feel like you've got your feet under the desk and you've achieved the KPIs that you set out to achieve, and then the goalposts had moved. And so it's interesting that you described around a culture for change, because actually in very different environments you can still sort of ready the ground around willingness, acceptance, openness around change. But actually a culture comes down to so many different inputs, right? Every individual is a net contributor to a culture, and every individual has a different set of values or mindsets, ways in which they think about their selves and their position within their environment, and also their openness and willingness to embrace change. And that adds up either to a big net positive around openness to and willingness to change, or a mediocre openness and willingness around change. So culture is a really kind of complex beast. But what do you? I guess what comes up for me is, what do you think as a leader, as a transformation, as a contributor towards transformation? What do you think you can do to impact on the culture?
It's a really good question, because as you were speaking, one of the things that struck me was that building an adaptable culture without exhausting people, so you're not just creating change for change's sake in order to make people adaptable. You might recruit for adaptability. You might make that as part of the behaviours that the organisation measures against, for example. I think that's a really important thought through way to build an adaptable organisation, rather than have it as a byproduct of changing every 5 minutes and people have to become adaptable. Because I think you're right. I think there's not only a reticence to it, but I think eventually people just keep their head down and go, we've seen this before. It doesn't come to anything, and we'll be changing again in 6 months' time or 6 weeks' time anyway. So just keep your head down and don't engage in it for that reason. So there's not just a hesitancy or whatever. There's almost a very direct and felt avoidance of taking part in it. And actually, I'm stepping right back from this. So I think you make some really good points around, irrespective of the size of the organisation, setting up the culture to encourage adaptability, I think is a really key stage. And for me, that happens through the leadership of the organisation. Now, you'd probably rightly come back to me and Nejmi and say, Glenn, you would say leadership, and yeah, I would, because a mantra you'll have heard me say lots, and so will anybody that's spent any time in a room with me when we talk about leadership, is all roads lead to leadership, right? They don't lead to Rome, they lead to leadership. Because irrespective of whether we're talking about a successful change or a change that went off the rails, and we'll come back to maybe turning points and some of this lovely work that EY have just recently published around turning points. Irrespective of those two extremes, those impacts will have been driven by leadership. And again, we're not just talking about the exec, it's everybody. So if it's gone really well, that will be down to the leadership that was displayed, excuse me, leading transformation, enacting transformation, receiving transformation, and making it come to life. Or on the flip side, if it's gone horribly wrong, it'll equally be the responsibility of leadership because they've not done X, Y, and Z. So I genuinely think that leadership capability in this space, that ability to, so the net result, I'm just thinking this through out loud, the net result would be a more adaptable leadership, a more adaptable culture that's driven through leaders who are able to be very clear on what the outcomes that they're there and they're required to deliver, and see how they can engage, use the importance of people, the people around them in their teams, etc., to drive that. I think if you focus on systems and processes only or mostly, you miss the fact that actually it's those things with a pulse, and a warm-blooded that are ultimately going to deliver that. And if you've got leaders that are so busy focusing just on how we do this, not through whom we are going to do this, the chances of success go down dramatically. And the challenge, and I'm not suggesting this is easy, by the way, the challenge is when you're busy doing as a leader, I think it takes some real courage and also some strength of mind to kind of go, actually, I'm going to take a step back here and see how the people are doing, because the people are the ones employing the processes and systems that we're creating. Does that make sense? I'm waffling a little bit because I'm thinking that through in relation to the question as you've asked it, but I think it's too easy to focus on the hard stuff, and I hate myself for calling it this, but the softer stuff, the people side is so key to delivering successful transformation. And if you haven't got the leadership capability to do that, that's also part of that cultural development I think you need to focus on.
Yeah, no, it does make sense, because actually, you've seen it, especially when, if it's a complex change and it's multifaceted and it's going to take a hell of a lot of energy and time and effort to get there, the chances are also that you're, the focus around, how to get there as a leader, will be far more on like the what or the how, as you described it.
Yeah.
But actually, building in what comes up for me is like building in like habits, rituals, even into your working week or working months, to make sure that you are sensitive to and engaging with the people that will be, most affected, to be able to, check in and understand and lay the groundwork, soften the thinking, so that the blockers to change around, resistance aren't felt, or at least are reduced. I always think about it, I've seen that within myself, around some of the points that you made before, when there's a reticence to change and you're like, oh, another one, are we gonna is this one gonna stick, or is it gonna land? Is it worthwhile, putting my energy into making it work? If you're leading a transformation, or if you're leading a team that's going to be required to do some things in a slightly different way, that stuff, that kind of thinking, or that thought process is really corrosive towards being able to achieve your outcomes that you want to achieve. But often that's not the stuff that's said out loud, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you ensure that you are, again, sensitive to aware of this stuff, and being able to change it if or when it does show itself amongst your people? One of the things that I've seen really kind of work in a fast change, or in a pacey change environment, is actually building in reflective time, habits on a weekly basis, to really think about how clear am I on how my people are thinking or feeling around what's coming down the line, and actually challenging yourself to expressly ask yourself, challenge your assumptions. Are you assuming that people are clear, that they understand, that they're on board, because you haven't seen anything to the converse? Or do you know that those things are present because you've had those conversations, and you've been able to hear and understand that from the people that you lead? Actually building in reflective time to challenge yourself on that, and then act on it, when it's typically, that's not going to find itself in your calendar on a weekly basis, unless you are putting in the time to be really active on that.
Yeah, so I love that, because to some extent what you're asking or suggesting that leaders do is they systematize the people piece. And I think that's actually a really wise counsel for leaders who are likely to be super busy delivering the key impacts of the change effort, leading from the front potentially, and waving the banner, and forward and encouraging people to deliver, but actually not spending enough time, because of the output driven kind of nature of change, to actually reflect on the people in their team. And to some extent, with certain types of leaders, and I am generalizing here, but with types of leaders who are either very action oriented, or maybe very, very technical, or both, maybe the people piece is not as high up their agenda as possible. A neat trick is you play to your preference and systematize reflecting on how the people are doing around you. I think is a really lovely and much subtler tactic or hack than at first appreciated. I think it's a great call, because that awareness, and let's reference this piece of work by EY. They originally did some work on change in 2022, and they've just produced we'll put a link in the show notes to a really nicely produced review, I think, of their own work. And an addition to that is they've got this reflection on how important turning points are. That's their language. Turning points are in transformation processes. And one of the things they urge leaders to do is sense when those turning points are likely to be arriving. And I think that takes an awful lot of skill. Honestly, I think it's a really important point, and I'm not in any way diluting the importance of the point they're making. I think that takes some sophistication as a leader, don't you? To be sensing when something might be happening. I think that takes a lot of skill when you're in the middle of an incredibly busy moment of transformation and change. I think that's really hard. So, as you've suggested, taking moments out, but that are planned, they are part of your transformation plan. They become part of how you're going to deliver transformation, is reflecting on the people. I think it needs to be as obvious and overt as that. I don't know if you'd agree, but I think it's at least a way to help reduce the risks of not spending enough time thinking about the people. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think like the idea of being able to effectively, it's like being able to sense risk, and we all inherently, identify and acknowledge when there are risks, inherent. Like we know that change is tough and that people can demonstrate resistance to it, but actually being able to sense and get ahead of and identify when those moments when that's going to be at its net lowest amongst the team that you're leading or amongst the organisation, and get ahead of that, interact in order to change that trajectory. Absolutely, it feels like it's a useful insight to help like frame some of the thinking around like when to act. But I would actually argue that when to act is all the time throughout a transformation. Like, burying that into like the rhythms and habits of what of navigating all the way through will help to kind of minimize the trajectory kind of dipping off.
Yeah, and I actually you've sparked a thought, which is to go back to the couple of examples I gave earlier on about people that we've worked with quite recently who have moved to a global model from a regional model, or who have bought organisations and other organisations that have bought organisations into their fold, and bemoaning the fact that change isn't happening quickly enough. I think those turning points, and again, EY would suggest this is true, and I think this is what you're hinting at as well, which is those turning points, they're not, you don't just have to play defense on them in the sense that you want to try and stem the drop off of the transformation, but actually done well. And to your point, having a kind of scanning mentality that as a leader, you're kind of going, how are things going? What do I need to do to help movement? Can actually change those turning points into moments of acceleration, not just stopping the slowing down. So I think they become an enabling moment within the transformation process when they're done well. To your point, I think if you aren't doing that all the time, there's a real danger of missing something that could be a turning point, or missing an opportunity to accelerate that change more. And it takes some skill. I think EY in that report referred to it as sense making. So I'm sensing this, but just because I'm sensing it, it doesn't make it a thing. It means that I've just picked up some information. People feel disgruntled, disengaged, exhausted. Is it a thing, or is it just the fact we've moved into autumn and the nights are closing in and the weather's rubbish? I'm using that as a flip example just to sort of to prove the point. And I think I think there's some real. I come back to this point. I don't want anyone to go away thinking that either you or I feel that the challenges for leaders of change aren't real and blooming hard to do because of the scale of everything that's going on and the busyness that's usually attached to that. So we're not saying that. So therefore, how do you create the space to notice and sense make these turning points when they come? Really important discipline. And I love your idea of habit. So, what's your habit as a leader that increases the likelihood of you spotting those moments, judging them correctly, and then responding appropriately?
Yeah, I like that.
What's your if you were going to take something from that piece, and again, I'm mindful that the audience haven't read the article necessarily that we're referring to, but if you maybe couple it with other transformation work that you're familiar with, was there a key takeaway that you thought actually there's something in that if leaders took that on, that would increase the likelihood of transformation being successful, aside from the kind of turning point tactical stuff we've just talked about? Anything that you took from it that you sort of think, that would be really cool? It
seems okay, my response is going to seem really obvious, and it's the piece around like purpose, like the purpose, like coming back to the why. So there's something in there.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a model that gives like a bunch of different things to focus on in order to improve the chances of transformational success, and purposeful vision is one of the areas. Now, I don't think there's anything dramatically new in that, right? Like, you want to be clear on what the purpose is of, why an outcome, why you're on a journey, or what outcomes you're looking to deliver. But the reason why I think that it kind of sparked something in me was coming back to this, coming back to thinking about, like, well, what really gets in the way of change, like landing effectively. And too often, I think certainly in the experiences that I've had when I've been a participant of change, but not been the like within that kind of first group that we spoke about, like the executive leadership of that group, like being more of a middle manager or someone who's going to take the messaging and have to own that with my team, but maybe I haven't really done the work to think about what's in it for me, and why do I think this is the right thing, and how am I actually going to really effectively lead others to believe in the change that's going to be required of them. And so the thing that jumped out, or the reminder there, was around that was described in the research around purposeful vision, was really around the reminder that as a leader, it's really, really important to do the work personally, to internalize the why and make it your own. To actually think about, well, actually, why is this meaningful? Why is this going to be a good thing? And do I believe in this? And what am I willing to do to demonstrate that belief? Because it's incumbent on everyone to get behind it in order to make a change successful, a transformation successful. And if you are not willing to do that work, or if you haven't done that work, it's going to be very, very difficult to lead your team to meet the expectations of the outcome itself, because people take cues from you as a leader, and even if you're not saying the thing, that you don't believe it, or that it's not, whatever, even if you're not saying those things, you're saying the right things, we are very, very sensitive to picking up on whether we believe, whether it's a message is compelling, and whether we think that the other person believes in it when they're sharing it with us, and so on and so forth. And so that kind of sparked that thinking, because I was like, oh, actually, where have I done work to help on solving for that challenge? And it came up with it led me to some thinking around some work that I've done in the past around helping people to really think about and internalize that. If a change is coming, there are some useful things that you can think about to help it make it real for you, which is, what's your own relationship to change? Do you find change or challenge exciting? Do you find it a little bit scary, or the unknown is unnerving in some way? Actually doing the work to think about, well, what's your how do you feel when there's change on the horizon, and actually doing that kind of internal work to get to grips with that, but also to again understand a little bit more about what your patterns are, what your behaviors are, or your habits or anti-habits even, that show themselves when change is afoot. Are you likely to are you likely to get on board with it, and you demonstrate that through your actions? Or are you likely to be a bit more reticent about it, behind the curve of change? And that's your those are the patterns of behaviors that you tend to have. Again, understanding yourself and your own relationship with change, with leadership, with the vision of what it is, the why around what it is, doing that work, and then encouraging, of course, your team to do similar work, so that they can get on board with the vision, understand the purpose, connect with the purpose, and make it their own. Because ultimately, that by guiding, by leading through the change, through in an authentic and true sense, you'll set your team up for the maximum chances of being able to take that lead.
I think that's a brilliant shout. Yeah, I think that's a really fabulous insight, especially when I think purpose can sometimes be used as little more than marketing material inside the organization. It kind of becomes an internal comms piece, which is important, but it doesn't address how that affects the individual. And I think you made a lovely point, which is if you as the leader of other people aren't doing that work for yourself, in effect, all you're doing is you're using internal comms to try and convince the rest of your team, the answer to what's in it for me, which they'll all be asking, by the way, is somehow embedded in the purpose. Well, it's not. And there's work to be done. And so rather than it sort of coming from comms to your team and you're just the vehicle to passing that on, actually thinking it through, really coming to grips with it, being honest with yourself about what you're fearful of,
Absolutely.
what you're not looking forward to. I think it's such a cool point.
It's not a whitewashing exercise, right? Like your answer might not be at the 100%, I can be the golden poster child for this change, right? There might be some real things in there that you're not entirely clear of. And you're not entirely supportive of or excited by, but even, doing the work to understand and establish, well, what bits of it can I get behind? What bits am I not 100% there with? And being able to, be honest with how you're leading, the others around that, maybe not 100%. If you're fully not on board, then obviously, it might be quite challenging to go there. You'll be unlikely to deliver on the outcome if you're not quite there. But being honest and authentic in how you lead others, people will appreciate, recognize, and get behind that too. And obviously, if there are gaps, doing the work to help to cover those gaps. If there are questions that still exist, again, making sure that you're asking those questions so that you can get to grips with what the change is and how it's going to affect you and your people, so that you can again.
I have a little watch out, if I might share, Nejmi, because you prompted a thought that pinged off in my head, which is I love change. I absolutely love it. If anything's static for more than about 5 minutes, I just get bored. And I find an energy in change. I really, I love it. And as long as it's the change that I can either make sense of or I can see the upside to, as long as that's broadly good, then, I think a watch out for leaders when they're doing that work is if you kind of look at it and your conclusion is, why would we not? The danger is that you look through that lens at some of your team who might be being resistant or fearful or not engaging. And you're kind of going, well, why would you not? It's kind of common sense. But that's because you're approaching that change through your lens, not doing something that is akin to, but maybe this is a topic for another podcast. I'm not a fan of the idea of empathy as a concept. I think it's flawed in all sorts of ways. That's not to say you shouldn't try and see the world through the lenses that other people. And if you can't, then ask questions, be curious, help people make sense of it for themselves. I think it's such a cool point that you do the work for yourself, but you don't then project that onto the team. And as you rightly said, help them through that work, because that's the only way you're going to get the engagement that you're going to need to make it happen. And at that point, whether it's a turning point at an organizational level or a turning point at an individual level, there's a good chance you can morph that turning point into an accelerator of change, or at worst, stop it becoming a detractor to the change that you're going to make. I think that's, and we've just really spent some time talking about, so off the back of these 72 conversations I had with chief transformation officers, chief operating officers, chief people officers about transformation and change inside organizations, we created a tool called the Organizational Change Scorecard. And it was really trying to help organizations mitigate risk in the 3 areas that all of those interviews suggested were really most important. One was resources risk. The third was cultural risk, and we've talked a little bit about that. But the second was capability risk, particularly leadership capability risk. And I think we've hinted here at, we're not suggesting it's easy, but I think we've given you some ideas about how leaders can both systematize thinking about the people piece and then actually how you could go around thinking about through change for yourself, and then how that's going to be impacting your team and how you might be able to help them, because it's not easy. But that was, so we can put the link in the show notes if people are interested. It's free. There's no charge, and you get a report back based on your profile against some of the things that you can then do to help mitigate those risks. But it's really interesting that we've found ourselves talking about, in a completely unplanned way, talking about the role of leadership and leadership capability, because it's so central to making transformation efforts work well.
Which of those three risks do we spend most time on?
Well, could you guess?
Is it the middle one?
Well, I think it's resort. I think it's back to the point where we started, which is the danger is that organizations, because you can plan resource, you can plan processes, you can plan systems, because they're not, in many ways, they're not quite so complex. They might be complicated, but they're not necessarily complex in the same way. You can spend a lot of time on those, and I think there's a lot of time in terms of how we trim the resources and use those effectively, forgetting that a good bulk of those resources are indeed human beings with a pulse and emotions and all the things that go into meeting change, either positively or not. So I think we've tested. I can't remember how many people have now completed it, but what was interesting was 15% of people that have tried that profiling tool come out as high risk they have a high risk profile across all three areas. 56% of people come out as a medium risk across all the profiles, and only therefore the remainder 31% come out as low risk across all those profiles. So actually that 69% is broadly, ironically, I'd only literally thought about it now, is broadly reflective of that 70% Cotter figure. Is there something magical about this 70% number? I don't know. But I think there are ways of thinking about those areas and actively trying to, to reduce the risks. And in this, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole, but when you think about transformation, do you think there is almost a kind of seesaw relationship between, just by reducing risk, do you proportionally increase the likelihood of success?
Depends on the risk. Not all risks are born equal, right? So in my mind, risk is, you can break down into the impact and the probability of a said problem. So, and so the fact that there might be three risks or three areas or categories of risk, it might be that actually one is more, has the impact about said risk. It has a much bigger chance of derailing the whole thing. In my mind, like if you were to talk about like people risk, or like the resistance to change, for example, around adoption, I would argue that might feature slightly higher than like a brand risk, for example. No,
that makes sense. But I think that they're two different, because we talked at the beginning about reducing risks in relation to transformation and improving the chances of success. I think hopefully what we've done is highlight that there are ways to reduce the risks associated with them. And look, there's a whole library's worth of material. There's a whole internet's worth of material on transformation and change in organisation, because it's so important, because it's so costly to get it wrong. But I think if there's ways to think about what is my role as a leader, whether I'm the change or transformation team or a more dispersed leader in the organisation. Now, how do I help reduce the risks, which may increase the chances of success, but not linearly, but by stopping the wheels coming off, we're increasing the chance of this thing landing well. And then, to your point, how do I maximise the chances of success? What else have we got to do, to turn up the heat on the things that are going to really give this the very best chance possible of succeeding? That is a complicated task inside an ever-changing, volatile kind of environment. It's the role of a leader, and whilst I think you and I acknowledge that's not easy, is super important. Your role, the leader's role in change, if an effective organisational change, absolutely critical because of the reach that you have inside the organisation. And I don't care whether you are a team leader of 2, or you're the CEO, that you're still impacting people more than just yourself, right?
Yeah. Nice.
So good fun, good, an important topic, a good one for us to play around with some really interesting new research. This idea of turning points and the role of leaders and the centrality of people. I think that's probably the thing that's come away from me. I'm taking away most centrally is, and one of the I think she was a chief operating officer, actually said to me, "It's not difficult. All change is about people." They kind of go, yeah, but that's probably not where most organisations spend their time. I think what we've done, I hope, is just gently knock that nail on the head to go, yeah, we're just driving home that message about the people piece being so key. And obviously, as part of that, the leaders and the role of leaders in helping people through change is key too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've really enjoyed having this conversation around,
Me too.
I think really thinking about the people component, the major risk that around transformation, and hopefully giving people a couple of ideas around how they might want to, or how they might mitigate for some of those risks too.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And what we would just like to remind you of is that we're very keen that these impactful conversations, which will be Nejmi and myself discussing key topics that we hope you find interesting, but also increasingly we'll have guests come onto the show too who are experts or very experienced people in a particular topic. So we'll start to broaden these conversations out a little bit. But what we really hope is that there's impact that you're taking from the conversations, and the only way that you can say it's truly impactful is that you then go and do something with that. And what we'd really love for you to do is to contact us as a result of taking away some of the insights that we've shared, and in an anonymized form. So don't name your organization, don't name the individuals that you're kind of quoting in your example, but 2 or 3 lines on how it's positively impacted the work on, and in this context it's around leading transformation and change in your organization. That would be fantastic. And then Nejmi and I can pick some of the best examples for that for our next podcast, and share and discuss some of those with you on the next show. Until the next time, Nejmi, that was really good fun, sir. Thank you very much. I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Cheers.